Yo, what's up everyone? It is Dynamics here. Welcome back to my channel. Hey, the first thing I want to do is say thanks to those of you who have liked and subscribed to my channel. It's really appreciated. It'll help my channel to grow and obviously reach more people who will benefit from this content that I'm providing. I got some great feedback from the first two videos on sub bass using phase cancellation and modulation as a creative tool for movement. So I'm really stoked that you guys are actually digging that. So I'll leave a link for it up here somewhere. I think that's where it goes. Now today's session is going to be on drums. This is a subject I get asked about a lot. It's also a part that I get complimented on a lot, which I really appreciate. Before we get into it, there's just a couple of things that I want to cover off. So the first thing is the context of parts. This is really key overall for when you're building music, is to have the right things that go together. So for example, you're starting out building a kit and you've got an electronic sort of kick drum or a synthesized kick drum that doesn't sound like a normal organic kick drum. So you're going to pick things that go together with that. So it's going to be a synth kind of electronic snare and hi-hat, etc. If you've got things that are not sensical in terms of context with one another, it probably won't sound right. It's not to say that they won't, but they probably won't sound right together. I'm sure when you've been working on a track, maybe you've got a sample that you really like or a patch that you really like and you're really keen to use it in a track, and you're working on a track and you drop it in the session and it just doesn't sound right, and it's likely that the guilty culprit for that is because in context those things just don't go together. So that's a real key part to think about. The next part is contrast. Contrast is such an important tool when you're working on music, and essentially any kind of art medium really, when you think about it. I mean, if you look behind me, there's two different lights. There's amber and there's blue. Contrast. I could have one color and it might look all right, but it would probably be a little bit too dimensional and a bit boring. So the same thing is with music. We have these contrasting elements that act as a reference to one another. Now, in terms of methods about how we might go about making drums, be open-minded. There's not one single way to do it. If you're a beginner, maybe pick a single method to help you progress and get good, because you'll find that when you try a different method, they'll cross-pollinate. The things that you've learned in that method will go over to the other one. So you might, for example, do what I'm going to show you today, which is working with audio with one-shots inside of your DAW sequencer. But there's also the option of working with, for example, MIDI instruments. So you might use a sequencer, sampler, drum editor that can load up different drum hits, or you might use XLN Audio's Addictive Drums to build yourself a kit and do it that way. It's really up to you. But if we go back over to this session here, this is where we're going to start from. And what I'm going to cover for you is in parts. The first part, which is the selection of sounds, why I've selected them, and then how I've placed these different shots within the drum sequence, and thinking about things like groove. Then we'll move on to another separate video where I'll cover off some basic processing, and then we'll continue on from there. So we're starting with the foundations and then we're going to progress forward. So it'll be in sort of bite-sized videos for you guys, and you can come back to it at your leisure. So before we get into it, if you're new here today, please like and subscribe. It will help my channel and I'll be bringing more content for you guys to help you with your productions. Sweet. So let's get into it. So first up, we've got our kick drum. The reason I picked this kick, it's got a really good transient, it's got a really nice body and fundamental, and it's got a nice low end thump. If we look at it under the analyzer, we can see that it's got some key indicators, these things being these peaks here. We've got our transient where the kick drum beater hits the skin of the drum. Then we've got this peak over here, which is the fundamental, essentially the body of the kick drum. And down the bottom is where the air escapes the back of the kick drum and gives us that low end thump. I've then got a second kick drum. Now this sound you'll hear is a lot rounder. It's a bit smoother. And what this particular kick drum is doing is acting as the sort of ghost kicks, the softer kicks. So if you imagine a drummer playing a break, you'll see them hitting their accented kicks where they hit with more velocity, and then they've got the softer hits. And essentially, that's what this particular kick drum is doing. So the sum of the two parts, we've got this sort of rebounding soft kick drum bouncing off the back of the main accents. The next element is we bring in a snare. Now I've chosen this snare because it's got a really nice fundamental, it's got a really crisp and snappy sound. So I felt that in context to the kick drums, they were working really well against one another. If we solo the snare drum and have a look at it under our analyzer, we'll be able to see some key indicators as well. So if I zoom out, play the snare, you can see here we've got this nice fundamental frequency sitting around about 300 hertz or so. So that's a great thing for us to see. We've also got this nice top end sitting up the top, so we know it's going to cut through in the mix. Straight away, a good source sound that's going to help us along. The other thing which I've done is added in a top over the top of the snare. And if we look at the sample, which is this one here, you can see that I've cut them shorter on some of them, and you'll see I've got these fades. And they're all slightly different. And what that's doing is adjusting the length. It's a kind of pseudo trick of the ear where I'm intending to replicate a drummer not hitting a snare drum exactly the same way every single time. So even though the sample is exactly the same every single time, this little trick can just fool our ears into accepting that it's a bit more human in nature. So we'll break away, listen to the audio together, and then we'll introduce the next part, which is our hi-hats. Alright, so we've got 4 to the floor with our hi-hats. It's giving us a nice solid metronome in which to follow. It's the foundation. The next part, which is to introduce the other hi-hats that we're going to need to build the groove around the track. So, with that being said, I've got 5 hi-hats all together. Now, I want you to listen as I start to bring these different hi-hats in. And you'll notice if you look at the sequence here, that these hi-hats through 1 and 5 are sort of scattered. Now, one thing I've seen a lot of people do and heard people do is they pick a bunch of different hi-hats and they kind of draw in a pattern. So they'll have, their first hi-hat, and then they put in the second hi-hat, and then go back to the first hi-hat, and then they put in a third hi-hat, and back to the first, and then put in the fourth. And these kinds of like simple mathematical stepped patterns. Is not to say that that doesn't work. Quite often it'll end up in a kind of racy kind of hi-hat rhythm, but a lot of the time it can end up sounding a bit unnatural. And if you're finding that when you're working on your drums, that when you start putting in these elements, it just starts to not feel the same, it's probably because of that. Instead, think about elements being placed. So you take these other sounds that you've selected and place them along the grid, but the key is place them while the beat's playing and take them in and out and you just do one at a time, and you're placing them to go, okay, that feels right. Oh, that doesn't feel right. Oh, do I need to trim it or stretch it or whatever? It depends on what you're going for. So I'll bring in each hi-hat, and I want you to listen and kind of think about how I was maybe thinking about it when I was placing them against the beat. Second hi-hat. Third hi-hat. Fourth hi-hat. Fifth hi-hat. Without. With. So you get the idea. Now, most of them are just sort of like snappy, transient type hits. There's one here, this one. It's got a little bit more of a kind of like an open hi-hat sound, but it's real short and snappy. So that gives us nice contrast against, you know, these kind of typical straight hits. You see, so think about grabbing sounds that are slightly varied like that as well, and it will give it a lot more of a natural feel. Okay, so the next part is we're going to add in some open hi-hat. So to replicate, you know, the method of a real drummer, they're obviously playing their closed hi-hat, and they will take their foot off the pedal and it will open the hi-hat. And so, you know, that opens the sound, and then they snap with the pedal back down again, and you get this, you know, closing or choking sound on the hi-hat. So you look for a sound sample that does a choke, and you place them in and accent that through the beat as well. So I've actually got two of them. The second one isn't doing a whole lot. It's just contrasting against the first one, and they're kind of blending into one another. And the second hi-hat has a kind of more of an interesting sound effects type sound. I just thought it sounded kind of cool. I might use it, I might not, but let's get into hearing how that sounds with the hi-hats introduced. Sorry, the open hi-hats. Without. With. Cool. So it's sounding pretty good so far. The next part that we want to add in is some percussive element. So often when you listen to D&B beats, you'll hear some kind of shuffle. Not all the time, but it definitely helps with groove, gives it a bit more of a rolling sound. Now what I've done in this particular beat is I grabbed an audio sample, and originally it was just 16s, but the loop itself had a lot of different velocities, and it sounded very human. So what I did was I chopped it up, and then I placed it within the beat. So again, the same principle I followed with the hi-hats. I was playing the beat, I was placing the elements in context to what I was hearing until it sounded right. And this is a trial and error type thing. The last thing you want to do is clutter up your drum sequence with a whole bunch of sounds just because you're throwing loops and stuff against the wall. So chopped it up, and you can hear the difference it makes when I add it in. So let's play the beat. Add the shuffle. Great. So the next thing that I'm going to introduce into the beat is a tambourine. So one thing that you'll hear in a lot of tracks is the use of tambourines and shakers. They're a really good way to help carry a tune to keep interest running just by introducing something as simple as that over the beat. I'm sure you've heard this in heaps of tracks that you've listened to and played where they do this, and it's so simple, but it makes a big difference. So it's a good idea to get these elements down right in the front before you start building the other musical elements of the track. So without the tambourine, and then I'll introduce it. Without. Awesome. So the beat, it was already sounding foundationally really good. The next part is we'll go over to the second section, and in this part I've introduced some rides. Now I've used two different sources. The first thing that I want to point out is that these rides are doing a call and response. The first one is just a straight sample. When you look at the ride, you'll see here that I've pulled down the amplitude on different parts of the sample, and what that's doing is essentially creating different velocity and amplitude. It's a way of making it sound more human. It's a really good trick when you're dealing with a sample that is the same to make it not so flat and two-dimensional and a little bit more human feeling and sound. The second part, I've got a loop out of a break. So I grabbed a break and it had these rides in it and I really liked it. I chopped out all the other elements. I didn't want the kicks and the snares and just left myself with those rides. I did a bit of processing. But the great thing is the rides, because they've come from a drum break, none of those samples are exactly the same. So instantly I'm going to get a way more natural human sounding element in my break. So we'll play that through. Without. And with. Wicked. So there we have it. Just by selecting some good source sounds, we've been able to build up our break and get our track session ready to come up with, hopefully, a good track. So next part, we're going to move through to a little bit of processing and how we're going to work and process this drums moving forward. Thanks for joining me for part 1 of this drum tutorial. I hope you guys have found it helpful, it's inspired you, you've picked up some key concepts, and you've got the ability to go pick good source sounds and think about your placement of your drum hits. This was the foundational layer, as I said. Come back, join me for part 2, where we start to dig a little deeper under the hood as we start to mix and process these drums, and you'll see how the drum foundation will really come to life. So until then, like, subscribe, push the notification button, and I'll see you at part 2.